And sometime in the near future, we will also have the raw data available for anybody who wants to use statistical software in order to manipulate or cut and slice and dice in different ways if you know how to do that. So you're not gonna be able to find out how Keith Dvorak answered, but you will be able to find out how men in their 50s living in Winter Park may have that type of behavior. And that's really what we're looking for. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Len Sachs and Dr. Matt Boxer.
So thank you, Keith, and thank you, everyone. Really is a delight to be here, actually in person with a group of people. I know there are others of you out there who are watching us and on Zoom, and I hope at some point to get to meet some of you. During the presentation tonight, those of you who are on Zoom, if you have questions, put them in the chat. Matt, who's back in Boston, who's not able to travel right now, will answer them or we'll pass them on to me and I'll try to answer them. So one of the things I'd like to do tonight is take advantage of the fact that we are, that we are face to face with one another. And I'd like to hopefully have a conversation with you about the data. I thank Keith for his introduction. We are not, however, perfect. So there may be some things that are odd. What we did is we talked to around 1,300 people in the community, and we're trying to generalize and give you estimates of what the community writ large, tens of thousands of people, 25,000 households looks like. We are researchers, we are scientists, we're social scientists who care deeply about the validity, the accuracy of our data. But I like to say that accuracy is only 1/2 of what we do. The other part is that we do actionable research. We want to provide information to you to help you develop strategic plans, develop policies and programs that will enhance the quality of Jewish life in the Central Florida area. Doing these studies, by the way, is inordinately complicated. And it's complicated because unlike other surveys that are done, we don't have good benchmarks. When we do a survey of political attitudes, first of all, we know exactly how many men and women, educated people, not so educated people, people of different occupations, you know exactly from the census how many there are, and so you can adjust your data. Jewish world, also, by the way, in political polling, you know the answer. The first Tuesday in November each year, you learn what the real attitudes are, and you can see if your estimates of it based on a small sample, were correct or not. We don't have that in the Jewish world. We don't have that because, first of all, the census doesn't collect information about religion. And if you, to be honest about it, Judaism is not only a religion, it's a culture. It's something much bigger. It is not just belief, it is belonging, and it is behavior. And so these studies are complicated. We're trying to do the best that we can. So if you can put up, face the
audio.
Put up the slides.
Of course.
We'll get started. And please, I teach at a university, and I also teach at universities and with groups in Israel. I'm used to being interrupted. So if you have a question, by all means, raise it. Sound like a plan? Okay, so start the slideshow and just the next slide, if you will, just shows some of the topics that we're going to talk about. I'm going to run through them relatively quickly. There's no test, there's no exam at the end of this, so all the numbers and stuff you don't have to remember. They're in the reports, copies are here. Copies will be available online as well. What I'd like to do is suggest some of the the contours of the community as we have been able to understand it, and then hopefully have a productive conversation with you. So I'll talk briefly about methodology. I'll talk about some of the estimates, geography, and we'll work our way through to talking about some of the specifics, specific issues of what are the contours of the Central Florida Church community. So just on, next slide, just some guidelines in terms of looking at the data. First of all, we call the numbers that we will be giving you, the estimates that we're going to talk about, we call them point estimates. But they're estimates. In other words, we talked to 1,300 people, and on that basis, we're estimating what the total population looks like. There is what's called a confidence interval around each one of them. Don't get hung up on the specific numbers. We're looking for comparisons, and we're looking for big differences, large differences, not a point or two between one number and another number, but we're looking at big differences, and that's where we're going to draw inferences from. Also, our focus, and I think we do this uniquely at Brandeis, is that we look for patterns. We're not interested in single behavior. We're interested in how things go together. And we have a special way of doing that, which I will explain to you. Let me just get into it. Unless there are questions or comments. Okay. Next, please. So as I said, I lied. We had 1,400 respondents, more than 1,300. Developed questions and consultation with members of the board, community here, professionals. We also used samples from lists, not only of Federation, but of other organizations in the community. One of the reasons that we wanted to have 1,400 respondents is that one of the dirty secrets of doing survey research is that when you have a sample, first of all, you can have 1,000 people from the entire United States, the entire adult population, where the 250 million people. You can have 1,000 people, and you can oftentimes represent pretty well what the country is thinking. Where you run into trouble, though, is when you want to know what subgroups in the country think. You want to know what African Americans think. You want to know what Latin Jews think, or Latin people think. And anytime you, if you will, take the pizza, the big pie of America, and you slice it into pieces, your ability to generalize is dependent on how big that subgroup is. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk in general about the community. We're going to have some geographic and other ways of dividing the community. The smaller the group that you're concerned with, the more difficult it is, and the more you need really big differences to assure yourself that you're making an accurate, appropriate inference on the basis of that. I'm also going to say that I'm the director of the Cohen Center at Brandeis, but I don't do my work alone. Matt Boxer, who you will hear from throughout the presentation or later in the presentation, was the principal in the study, and we have a large team of people who we work with. So I'm the representative. I'm going to hand off all my difficult questions that I'm going to get from you to Matt to answer. Just one final comment, that last line about the response rate. The key to doing a decent survey is whether the people you randomly select actually agree to do it. We call this the response rate. And just so you know, response rates are terrible these days. People are bombarded. Everybody's bombarded with surveys, and telephone calls, and emails, and so on. And Pew, which recently published their 2020 Portrait of American Jewry, had a response rate of about 16%. We had almost double that response rate. And that gives us some increased confidence in the results, which in ways of testing. It's okay. Okay, next. Key findings, finally. Yeah.
I'm sorry, so does that mean that you sent out to 4,000 to 5,000 people and 1,400 people?
Yes, but we have, it's a bit more complicated than that. We we have different samples that we send to, so you have differences. But across the board, we had reasonably good response rate. Now, sometimes, since you're asking the question, I'm a professor, sometimes just getting good response rate isn't enough, because if the people who respond are the people who are the most interested, the most engaged, then you're going to screw up. I think we have developed some techniques that allow us to reach into populations that previously weren't included in community studies. I get accused sometimes of finding Jews or finding whatever. In fact, we are finding Jews. We are finding people who identify as Jewish, but don't have any contact with the Jewish community. And a secret, but we're going to talk about it a lot. You have lots of those people in Central Flori. Yeah.
Just for the folks online.
Yeah.
Moving,
Yeah.
microphone's not picking it up. So-
Okay. That's really hard. Okay, but I will stay here. My apologies to those of you online. I don't have a good, I'm not seeing myself easily, so I don't know when I'm getting out of focus. Yes.
They're hearing them.
But they're hearing me. Okay.
Or not.
Where's the microphone is?
The microphone is up there.
The microphone is up here. Okay. Thank you. Yes,
Question about the methodology.
sure.
If I am the owner of the West Central Florida Gymnasium, and I want to have all my people answer, is there a way to manipulate that where I can say, there's going to be a bunch of people who are going to get the survey? I know me personally, I didn't do it, I thought I'm not typical, so I chose not to. But what if, can somebody say, you gotta respond because we need those?
Great question. The simple answer is yes. And that's why one of the most difficult conversations I have with federations is that federations want to advertise the study when it goes out. And we do everything in our power to prevent that, because that does what you suggested, biases. And in fact, there are studies, I won't implicate the guilty in this, but there are Jewish community studies where segments of the Jewish community, because there was advertising about the study, advertised to their people, and that caused, we call it sample bias. We try to avoid that. We do everything in our power. But I'm going to, next time I have this conversation with a community, I'm going to quote you. Other questions? We're all set. Okay, findings. It's taken us a while to get here. Next, please. So I have to say, numbers are not the most important thing. How many Jews there are in a particular area is not in and of itself the most important issue. What we like to say is that what's important is, what do Jews do? What do Jews think? How do they behave? How do they interact? Well, to understand those things, you need the equivalent of the denominator. In other words, you need to know what proportion of people are doing X, Y, or Z, or hold X, Y, or Z attitudes. For that reason, figuring out what the population size is important. Methodologically, it's very complicated to do. But what you see here is that our estimate is that the community is 51,000 plus of Jewish individuals in 25,000, 26,000 households, and that there are a total of close to 70,000 individuals in Jewish households. So a Jewish household is a household where there is an adult who identifies as Jewish and, if you will, has a good reason to identify, as parents, converted, a Jewish education, etc. Non-Jews who live in these households could be a spouse, could be a child who is not being raised in any way Jewish. And so this is the estimate. You see here the estimate for the number of adults, the number of children, and in terms of Jewish and non-Jewish children, you've got almost 4,000 non-Jewish children living in Jewish households. Again, the reason to do this is so that we can figure out how engaged, how identified are the Jews of this community. But it's also kind of a roadmap to where you have, and I'm going to call them opportunities. Where are the opportunities to engage more people in the community? We okay on definitions, questions, comments? Matt, is anyone raising questions online?
Not yet.
Okay, not
We
yet.
do have a question of which countries are, which counties are included in the definitions.
So we're using your definition. So if you go to the next slide. So we've developed a map. See in the back row, you're squinting to see the map because it's not easy to read, but it's pretty easy if you look at it online. So we've divided the community based on the community's definition of some of the boundaries into 4 geographic areas. So this area, Maitland, Winter Park, are the center. They're the densely populated, the Jewish densely populated areas. And then the rest of the lines are kind of arbitrary. But what they show is that Jews don't only live in the central densely populated area. They live throughout this area. I'm not a geographic expert on Central Florida, but you see it here. Each of those dots represents 25 households. And what you see is that there's tremendous dispersion of the Jewish community. Now, the physical distance, I experienced it today just driving up here. The physical closeness of areas is probably less important than the highway system and the road system and so on, and patterns of where people work and where schools are and so on. But you see outside of the densely populated central Maitland Winter Park area, you've got a lot of dispersion. And you also have, you mentioned this before, but you had done a community study 1993, so more than 25 years ago. And during that period, there's been a 175% increase in the Jewish population of this area. And the population has grown not only in the central area, but throughout the area. And what's also clear is that institutions and organizations haven't mapped onto where the population growth is. By the way, the Jewish population growth roughly matches the census numbers on the growth of the Orlando and environs population increase over this same period of time. And in fact, it precisely matches the census data on the number of college-educated white population. And as the area has grown and attracted professionals and even high-tech industries, the Jewish population has grown in kind of lockstep. Okay, next. So this is the picture. I'm sorry if I'm blocking you guys. I'm afraid to move here. This is the picture of what households look like. About 2/3 of the households are households of couples. A third, no. The majority of the couples are intermarried, meaning only one Jewish adult, not two Jewish adults. But, and we'll talk about this later, in terms of raising Jewish children, children who are identified as being Jewish, unmarried households are more likely to be raising Jewish children. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Next, please. So this is just a little picture of who lives in these households. And some of the information that we have in this study, we're not doing it just to make this more complicated, but it turns out that serving singles is different than serving couples, serving families with children. And you see it, I can see it just by the wings, the various wings of this building, the JCCs, and the focus on child programs and early childhood, etc. So knowing what the demographic picture looks like, and we have the data by the 4 geographic areas, is, I hope, a useful piece. Now, one of the features of this community, and I'll just put it out there, is that in terms of religious engagement, you probably have the lowest level of participation in synagogues, worship communities, any community that we have studied. You have something like 16% of households are members of a worship community. Half of them, the language isn't good, but we call bricks and mortar synagogues, and means a traditionally structured synagogue with a board and a building can even a mortgage payoff can, whatever, and a rabbi, clergy, and often other Jewish clergy members and educators as well. That's only 7% of the households in the community, and another 7% are part of Chabad. And Chabad, there's no other way to describe it other than to say it is Chabad. It's a unique structure to them. Relatively few are part of independent minyanim and other communities. In Boston, for example, it's an increasingly important piece of it, not so much here. The national number, comparable number with the same question, is 35%, according to the Pew study that was done, was released last May. You get 2% who were members of synagogues. And I was having an earlier conversation this afternoon, and someone said, well, people, snowbirds come down here, although it seems less likely in Central Florida than other places in Florida. But I said, the pattern that I've seen is that people who come here permanently, they don't necessarily join a synagogue here, but they keep, for nostalgic reasons, commitment to their former community, they keep their membership. But however you slice it, you've got a low level of engagement in synagogues. And that probably deserves its own study to figure out exactly what's going on. Yeah.
I'm surprised that I can see the number, and I'm surprised that the national average is twice as much. How about other Florida communities? Are they also in that 30%? I was led to believe that they are lower.
So for those online, I'm just going to repeat the question. The question was, are other Florida communities close to the national average, or are they at a lower number? How do we compare it to the other Florida communities?
As I said, I think this is the lowest number I've seen. Matt, do you recall Palm Beach, Boca, West Palm?
Yeah, I don't recall exact numbers off the top of my head. They are, I believe they were all consistently below the national average, but they were higher than what we found in Central Florida.
Probably closer to, if my recollection is correct, probably closer to 25%, something like that.
It would be helpful if you, I think Sarasota participated in one
Right.
recently. If you can give us some information, not off the top of your head, but we
Yeah.
can follow up with you.
Matt did the Sarasota study, so we'll get that to you, and we'll look at what we know. Right, but by the way, it's not by the way. Regardless of what other communities are experiencing, this is still a low number. And figuring out what's actually going on is probably important. And I think my guess is that there are some unique pieces to the community here. Whether it's dispersion of people, whether it's other kinds of things yeah.
What's the distinction between the law and?
So the question for those online, why is there a distinction between Chabad and the brick and mortar synagogues?
For two reasons. One is because I think Chabad does operate differently than what we're calling bricks and mortar. We got to come up with a better name for bricks and mortar synagogues. On the one hand, just on a very pragmatic level, the membership model is completely different. You don't actually pay dues to a Chabad synagogue, a Chabad house, and Chabad sees its role as not just providing services either to, someplace to show up on the high holidays or even to educate your children. They are into, they have a different frame about it. And this is not I'm trying not to be theological about in the distinction, just at a practical, if you will, tactless level. They operate different, their financial model, et cetera, is different. So that's why we do it.
And how about the numbers of the bodies?
I actually
And the
think
question online,
yeah.
the follow-up was, how does the number for Chabad in our community compare to other communities?
Matt, I'll turn to you again. It's like my lifeline.
So it's about average, which is remarkable considering that roughly 60% of the Jews in Central Florida have little to no connection to Jewish organizations at all. What that means is that Chabad has become a dominant force in your area. They are really doing the work of reaching out to people and getting them engaged.
So just to translate or extend a little bit what Matt said, regardless of the proportion of the number of Chabad here, Chabad houses, the proportion is extraordinary. I don't think we've seen that in other communities. By the way, one of the things that is happening, and this is another reason to pay attention to Chabad, is they clearly have something that's working, that's being effective on the one hand. On the other hand, because of their structure, where rabbi comes to the community, and that's their community for life. But you have a whole new generation of Chabad rabbis, often the children of Chabad rabbis. And based on when people came out of Brooklyn to populate the world and create Chabad houses all over the world, I think we're about to experience the next generation, the offspring of Chabad rabbis. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens. And all of us in the Jewish community have to be part of talking with Chabad about these developments and understanding. Okay, next. So this is the denominational breakdown. This doesn't look so different from other communities compared to the national. More Masorti, more conservative Jews, a little fewer Reform Jews. but very, very small numbers of Orthodox Jews in the community. National average is closer to 10%. But some of that is just the New York, New Jersey issue. But it doesn't mean that the community is a different community. It doesn't have the kind of Orthodox presence that many other communities have. The most notable finding here, and this is characteristic of all communities, is the high number of people who identify with no denomination. Now, it used to be that if you were just Jewish, it meant that basically you were a cultural Jew. You knew that, you know, you were a Jew because other people often told you you were, but you didn't really engage in Jewish behavior. What's interesting now is that we have people who don't fit into any of the traditional denominational groups, but are very serious about their Judaism and maybe doing their Judaism outside. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, outside of the synagogue. So again, it is a challenge to engage these people, given the importance that synagogues have played in American Judaism since Jews came to this country. But it's obviously something that needs to be understood, and you have to figure out how to reach out to these individuals. What's also clear, by the way, is that denomination no longer, and I'll show you why we think this is particularly important, denomination no longer is a particularly useful way to group Jews. It's not explaining what they do, what they think, how they engage. Next.
Do you have a question?
I mean, yes, one thing that is a little confusing to me, maybe you can either say I'm analyzing right or wrong, but if you have a very large percentage, half of folks that are going to Chabad versus a traditional, what you call brick and mortar synagogue, yet only a very small number would self-describe themselves as Orthodox, and Chabad is an Orthodox movement, that to me says that the conservative and reform shuls in this community are not giving people what they want, because people who self-describe as conservative or reform are going to Chabad.
So for those online, a summary of the question, I'll do the best I can, is with such a small Orthodox population and Chabad being an Orthodox type organization and having the same number as the synagogues, it appears that that's showing that the synagogues are not offering people what they want, because people who are not Orthodox are going to Chabad. And how accurate is that? Did I do a good job?
Before you answer, can I just ask part of that
Absolutely.
question? Is the data saying that, or are you interpreting that? Because one of the things I heard very clearly in the beginning from Matthew Boxer, who's the researcher, who pointed out the statement, they're doing a better job of engagement. That doesn't mean because they're conservative or they're Orthodox. They're just doing a better job of engagement. People who are thirsty will go anywhere who leads them to water. So I understood your question. And maybe the data will back up the answer. Well, yes, they are. There is some, but I didn't get that at all. What I heard was they're doing a better job of engagement.
So the follow-up question was that the data or was that an interpretation? And going back to what Matt Boxer said, that Chabad is doing a better job. And does that mean that we've got thirsty people that are going to wherever they're led?
So it's a little bit of both.
I love it.
I'm going to do that.
I love it.
You're both right. The part that you're correct about is that Chabad is basically my Hebrew term for it would be a keruv organization. They are an outreach organization. They don't need to just, their mission, and they work at it 24/7, 24/7. And it's a rabbi and a rebbitzin together working as a team. That's the minimum core group. And then they bring their kids into it and so on. Their goal is to, they call it moving Jews up one step and then another step on the ladder of connection with Hashem, with God, with tradition, with being part of Jews. So it's not just that they're being passive and letting whoever comes to them come. They work at this really hard, and I agree with Matt. They are really effective at doing that. Pew has some really good data about the proportion of people who engage and where they come from. And I think 25%, if I'm not, that's the number I remember, of their participants identify as Reformed Jews. Maybe it's a smaller percentage, but because Reformed Jews are the largest denomination, it's a large number of people. And so, again, they know how to do it better, but also their mission is to bring people in, which is a different mission than trying to serve the people who pay membership dues. And I don't want to, this doesn't come across as pejorative in any way. It's not meant to be, but it's a different model. It's a different way of thinking. Okay, let's move on. So one of the things that we've been concerned about is, how do you group people? In other words, and what are the different groups? For me, a piece of this started because it goes back to National Jewish Population Survey done by the Federation System in 1990, and another one that was done in 2000 about how assimilated American Jews were. And this tagline got attached, will your grandchildren be Jewish? Will Judaism ever, is this the end of the road for Judaism because so many people were assimilating? And what was clear to me is that while people didn't necessarily belong to synagogues, while people didn't necessarily show up to Lane and to listen to erudite Divrei Torah on Shabbat, they engaged in Jewish life in different ways. And so we sought to do that. So we developed a procedure, where we applied a statistical procedure to take the actual behavior that, in this case, members of the Central Florida Jewish community told us they were doing, and we tried to see how the pieces fit together. So next, we developed a statistical technique. It's called latent class analysis, LCA. This is not our decision about how people behave. These are our names that we are attaching to it, but it was simply to describe what we were hearing from the respondents. So we divided the community into 5 parts, based again on their behavior, 18 separate behaviors, cultural behaviors, ritual behaviors, communal behaviors, etc. What you see here is that we describe 30% of the community as personal Jews. They don't step foot in a Jewish communal structure, but they often light Hanukkah, Hanukkah candles. They often go to a Seder. They don't, again, step foot in a synagogue, but it's not like their Jewishness is not at all part of that. And we have another group close to the same proportion, 29%, 30% of family Jews, people who do Jewish with their families, but again, aren't part of the community. And then and that's, by the way, 60% of this community. It's one of the highest levels that we've seen in studying any community. So it's not like these are people who their name is Cohen and they have have a grandparent and it's just a distant memory. They know that they're Jewish, they claim their Jewish identity, but behaviorally, they don't do anything that involves other people. And I like this term, Judaism is a contact sport. Judaism is a hard game to play just by yourself. We have some rules about it. You need 10 people, you need 9 people in the Torah to have a minyan in order to do certain things. We do things together. Our responsibility toward one another is key. And these people don't seem to reflect it, although some of them, you'll see in a moment, do Jewish philanthropy. At the other end, you've got a group, relatively small, 6% of the community, who are the immersed Jews. They do everything. They're involved in ritual. They go to shul almost every Shabbat. They celebrate the Chagim, et cetera, et cetera. But they also do, or not, but in addition, they do cultural things. They read Jewish books. They're engaged with Israel. They're engaged with Jewish organizations. They do Jewish philanthropy. It's a relatively small group. And then you have 2 other groups, people who do different levels of engagement that includes synagogues and communal activities, but distinguishes them from the immersed. Now, so why do we, let me, before I tell you why we do this, let me do the next slide. And there you can look at it in the book. This is the 18 behaviors with the proportion in each group that does these things. The darker the square, the more people in that group are doing that particular behavior. What we're hoping for is that you'll look at this and you'll say, we got the majority of our people who are in this personal and family group. They're not totally disconnected from Judaism. What are do we see some windows here? Do we see some doorways in terms of engaging them with the community, serving their interests? I spend a lot of my time studying Birthright Israel. I've been working with Birthright, Taglit, as it's called in Hebrew, for the last, since its beginning 21 years ago. And we have studied 500,000 people who participated in Birthright, young people. 21 years ago, when I started this, these people were written off. And the argument was, well, they didn't go to day school. Many of them didn't get any Jewish education. They're clearly not interested in being Jewish. Let's focus our resources on the people who want to be Jewish. And let's give more to the people who are already there. And fortunately, the janitors, founders, philanthropists who created Birthright said, you know what? We're not going to give up on these people. And we think young adults are an important population. And so we're going to invest some money in them. I can tell you today, 20 years later, some of these people, we have a group of 4,000 people, half of whom went on Birthright, half of whom didn't go on Birthright. We've been following them for 20 years. Some only 15 years. We didn't come into our study until 2008 or something. There are completely different trajectories of engagement with Jewish life. That a simple, people thought 10 days, free vacation with a group of your peers, what a waste of money. But in fact, and I'd like to think to their credit, using data about this population, they were able to design a program, to design an educational framework that engaged them and actually change them. And so whatever you're hearing from me about the current sociodemography of the Central Florida Jewish community, remember, demography is not destiny. The whole purpose of this is to show you where things are now so that you can figure out strategies to address it and change them. That's your goal. Okay, next, unless there are questions. This sort of clear? Okay. So this is a chart. I won't go into detail. We're taking too much time as it is. But this is a chart that shows that denomination doesn't really tell you how engaged people are and what they're actually doing. So the Reform Jews, some of them are actually immersed. It's not just Orthodox Jews who are immersed in Judaism. There are lots of people who are not. Now, at the same time, the familial and the personal Jews are less engaged across the board. But again, these are windows. These are ways to understand the people who are part of your community so that you can develop strategies to respond. Next. This is the children. Again, why don't we just go to the next slide? Next slide. So this is a slide that shows, and I feel badly that I'm like blocking your way here, so but I want to be close to the microphone. This is a slide that shows how children are being raised in married and intermarried families. Near universal in married families. In intermarried families, I want to focus first on the 40-some-odd%, 44% who are being raised Jewishly. For some people, intermarriage was the end of the American Jewish community, but it's clearly not the end of the Jewish community, the American Jewish community. You've got nearly half being raised Jewish. You have another who are being exposed to Judaism and another religion. But perhaps the most important piece of this is that you've got a third of the children of intermarried parents who aren't being raised in any way with religion, without being raised without a moral, ethical framework, a framework of engagement with other people. Now, there are clearly secular ways to do this, but religion is one of those things that if it hadn't already been created, probably people would have created it because we need some way to transmit door by door, from generation to generation, a way of thinking and finding meaning in one's life. And this is an opportunity for the community. Yeah.
So earlier on, you talked about walking around this building and seeing the different wings that are involved, the wing involved in children. Are you aware of the percentage of Jews in early childhood?
Right. So Keith and I were talking yesterday about that.
15%.
Right.
Are Jewish.
But what I'm, if
It's not 15.
it's not 15.
Yeah.
What I paid attention to, Keith, what I paid attention to that you said to me, that you were telling me yesterday, were the plans for dramatically expanding this, because I haven't shown it in detail here. I think one of the issues is that you don't necessarily have early childhood centers where you have people, or you don't have the capacity where you have people to do things. But early childhood education, just in general, if you wanted an opening to engage families in Jewish life, actually for synagogue membership, bricks and mortar synagogue membership, although Chabad also runs early childhood centers. That's the place to do it.
Because some of us are hoping to get a lot of good information from the study,
Right.
as you're giving us, and have concerns that we are losing in our Central Florida area the Jewish part of Jewish. So whether it's no kosher butcher, no Jewish nursing home, all those kinds of things, we're getting further away from the Jewish part. And, I've spoken with Keith about that, and there are some plans to increase the Judaica component of the early childhood program. But for some of us, we're looking to this study to help us so that we don't lose the Jewish in the Jewish community.
So that's a slightly different issue of how do you ensure Jewish content in any of your child-focused or even adult-focused programs. Tikkun Olam without Jewish values is not really whatever Tikkun Olam is. It's not really Tikkun Olam. I will say that your question comment reminds me that years ago I did a study of Jewish summer camps. Amy Sales, my colleague, and I wrote a book called How Goodly Are Thy Tents? And one of the things, this was 2004, 2005, one of the issues was that Jewish camps had moved away from, well, in some ways they hadn't moved away, they'd never been there. Even camps under some of the denominational banners had relatively little Jewish content. Reform camps were afraid to buy kosher chickens on Friday night, lest that would turn off people in their community. One of the things that we showed is that actually people were quite hungry for Jewish content, that it added a whole new level of meaning. And I've been told our book, How Goodly Are Thy Tents, and some of the work that we did kind of gave permission to people to infuse camps with more Jewish content. And in fact, today, the situation compared to 15 years ago in Jewish summer camps is very different. Jewish summer camps are growing. In fact, one of the, I sound like an advertisement for myself, I don't mean it this way, but one of the things that we suggested was that there was no reason why Jewish camps needed to be, you needed to find a forest that you could, around the lake, that you could cut down trees and build log cabins for young children, that you could take over campuses of boarding schools and colleges and other things. And you could, whether it was teaching tennis, swimming, science, or whatever, you could infuse those programs with Jewish content, with Jewish values. And that's exactly what some of the things that happened. I won't take credit for it, but I did have the idea, or we did have the idea. How goodly are they tents? Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Couple of questions. First of all, that 44% at the bottom in gray, or whatever that says.
Yeah.
It says that there's some Jewish, they're raising the children Jewishly.
Mhm.
What does that mean? If the people are not associated with anything Jewish in the community, does that mean that they know that their parents are Jewish, that they like Shabbos candles, that they like Hanukkah candles? What extent does that 44% participate in?
The question for those online is, for the 44% that are of intermarried families that are raising their children Jewish, what does that mean that they're raising their children Jewish?
Matt, do you have any of the comments, the open-ended responses that might illustrate or respond to that question?
So it really runs the gamut. All the 44% statistics specifically means is that the parents say they are raising the children exclusively Jewish. Among the parents who are in that category, it runs the gamut from they're members of synagogues, they send their kids to Jewish schools, Jewish camps, they light Shabbos candles, they light Hanukkah candles, they keep kosher at home, they do everything, to folks who say they're raising their kids exclusively Jewish, but they don't really do much that's Jewish, at home or with close friends or family. It's the full range within that 44%. And similarly, within the 19%, it's much like any Jewish community, you really have the full range of behavior within that group.
So the bottom line is that there's a range. To go back to the earlier discussion, I'm going to go back to the room, but to go back to the earlier discussion about Chabad. Chabad says wherever you are, in some ways they've made the threshold decision. They're going to raise their children Jewishly. And then the question is, they may not, or the issue is that they may not have the education, that may not have come out of the home that whether it's celebrating Shabbat or even Hagim, that they don't know how to do it. And the question is, how do you help them do that?
One other question. This is a wonderful presentation, the slide presentation. I've been trying to follow it along, but I cannot in the book. It's much more concise, what I see on the screen than what's in the book. The concise one has nothing like that.
It doesn't matter, no,
No.
it doesn't matter.
So by the way, we'll first of all, we'll make available this slideshow. Yes,
Thank
so
you.
that absolutely.
Thank you very much.
That absolutely. I was going to say something else, but it escaped me. So any other questions? Anybody online, Matt?
No comments so far.
Okay. Does that mean they're not listening, they're not hearing? Or but, okay. Next, please. I know. Let me stick with the intermarriage, because intermarriage, the majority of couples are intermarried. So obviously it's an issue that the community needs to confront. One of the interesting things, and I had a debate with, there's an advocacy organization, 18 Doors for intermarried families, just intermarriage.com. And I've had an ongoing dispute with them because they are focused on welcoming, that the issue for every community is welcoming, and that intermarried families don't feel welcome enough. Well, it turns out that across every community that we've studied, not only do some intermarried families feel unwelcome, it's not the most important issue for them, but a nearly similar proportion of unmarried families don't feel welcome. And the bigger issue is an issue of Hebrew Chinuch, it's education. They don't feel knowledgeable enough to participate in the community. And nobody, especially highly educated people in the Jewish community, wants to feel not smart. They want to feel competent. And so many people became adults, moved into past adolescence, and even if they were a bar bat mitzvah, they celebrated at a community, they don't necessarily have the skills that's needed. And the question is, not the question, the issue for a community is, how do you bring those people in? How do you educate them without making them feel stupid? I can't say it any more directly. One really quick story. Around the time that we did the study of camps, we also did a study of Jewish life on college campuses. And we kept running into, I had a large research team, a woman we eventually called her Sarah. It's a composite of a bunch of people who gets invited. She's comes from a foreign background, gets invited to a Shabbat dinner at Hillel, very excited as a freshman. She goes to the dinner, they do kiddush, everybody gets up, goes to the hand washing station, and on the way back, she starts a conversation with the people that she's going with. And she's mortified by the time she gets back to the table to learn She doesn't know it's minhag. She doesn't know it's custom. It's not halacha that you don't speak after you wash your hands before you do motzi. And what she then said is, I never then went back to Hillel. We lost somebody because she didn't know. The examples I could think of are she didn't know that that's what you do. And we have to figure out a way to deal with that. And especially given the demography of this community, you need to contemplate stuff like that. Okay, next. So this is the preschool, 12%. The data. Yeah.
Do you take into account PJ Library?
Yeah, so PJ Library, I don't know if we have the slide. Do we have it here? Is it the next one? Matt, is it one of our slides?
I don't know if it's in the slide, but it's 25% of all households with age-eligible children are PJ Library subscribers.
It's strong.
Right, so PJ Library is really important. I must say I've been talking with Howard Grinspoon, funder of it, since he had the first idea. And for me, the key is not just the books, it's do the parents feel able to talk with their kids about it, and how do you provide that kind of support? Well, so that's another piece of this, which is, again, I'll go back to our metaphor of Judaism as a contact sport. Yes, you can do stuff in books, but it's got to be linked to something that has to do with actual and genuine, authentic relationships between people. Okay, next. So Jewish philanthropy. Over half of the households in the community said that they donated to a Jewish organization in the past year. 30%, however, only donated to non-Jewish organizations. Obviously, lots of room for growth here. Next.
Does that compare
We
with
do have
other
a question
countries?
in the chat about how many Hispanic Jews are in Central Florida. Will that be covered in the future slide?
We don't have that here. Matt, do you have that offhand?
Jews of color were 15%.
Matt?
That's included in Jews of color.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question.
So, excuse me. So the question was the proportion of Latin Hispanic Jews.
I believe it was 15% of Jewish adults.
Keith is your best student. He
That's
gets,
Jews of color. That
Right.
includes Latino,
well,
Latin includes Latins and those of, any person of color who's Jewish.
right. So by the way, so it's 15% are Latin plus all of the other categories. We have to be very careful though about, first of all, the term Hispanic Jew is not a good term. Hispanic Jews, I'm going to commit a sin here just by saying this, but those who are included in this category often recoil at its use. And it's gotten conflated with the Jews of color issue, and it's really a separate issue. And we're trying to sort that out now. And in fact, the Latin American Jewish community is a very different community. Those whose origins are in Cuba, Venezuela, Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, whatever, very, very different sets of issues. Okay, next.
You got a question?
Yeah.
The Jew, how our community compares with either other communities in Florida or nationwide with Jewish giving.
Right,
So the question for those online is, how does our community compare with other communities both in Florida and nationally when it comes to giving?
And so we had the slide right there. Next. So anti-Semitism is on always all of our minds. And one of the things we tried to track is how many people have been directly affected, the report details, the criteria for deciding whether it was a severe or a mild or moderate anti-Semitic attack, going from jokes that make unfair fun of Jews to more serious issues, including actual assault or other forms of direct discrimination. About 8% of the community reported. Seems similar to what we're seeing in other communities. For me, the issue here is not that anti-Semitism has morphed into a new mutated form, but it's how do we react to it? And the issue is, for me anyway, by calling attention to it, do we actually serve the interests of anti-Semites by disseminating negative stereotypes about Jews? When is it appropriate? How is it appropriate? Etc. So these are the data. Next. This is the participation by engagement group. We've sort of talked about this before. Just go on. It's how it's broken down by region. And we can talk about that later if there are questions. Next. And again, this is consistent with what we've been talking about in terms of how each of the different groups engages or doesn't engage in Jewish life. This is membership in organizations. Next. Next. This is on the JCCs, and here children and family programs, particularly in this building, are critical. It's interesting, the questions about the fitness centers, maybe because they don't have Jewish content, how important are they? There were some people for whom having fitness centers and whatever was an important piece, and obviously it's a central element to the, yeah.
What's the difference in between the two JCCs for the children and family outcomes? Higher?
So the question was, what's the difference between the Roth JCC and the Rosen JCC for children and family? What does it mean that the Rosen JCC is higher?
Matt, do you want to take a crack at that?
It's hard to say, partly because the numbers of members were so low overall. I suppose it's possible that for the difference might be because of the volume of different types of programs that are offered, the relative differences between the Roth and the Rosen JCC. My sense of things from talking to a number of members of the community was that there is just more variety at the Roth than there is at the Rosen. And that might mean that just that greater diversity might make for a little bit more spread in the types of programs that people participated in, or greater diversity in the people who participate at all.
Right. So the proportion of children's programs, if you don't have cultural programs, you don't have a lot of cultural programs, then you're going to have a larger percentage are going to be involved with children's programs. Okay, next. So I wanted to end on needs in the community and where the Jewish community, where the sense of responsibility that we have for one another comes into play. So now the context for this, remember, is that we did the study during COVID. And COVID we know from other work, our own and others, the impact of COVID, aside from the age difference, the age effects associated with the physical effects of the virus, that those who were economically and socially disadvantaged beforehand were much worse off. And in fact, many of the people who were well off became, if there is such a thing, more well off. And you see that here. So doing this study during the pandemic, close to 20% of the population saying that they can't make ends meet. And we measured it in a variety of ways. And we're pretty confident that this is a reliable finding, even as most of the community is doing perfectly fine from an economic point of view. Next.
In pre-COVID studies, what would that number be?
So the question was, in pre-COVID studies, what would that number typically look like?
So the number would have been, it was smaller, although since I don't have data here, I don't know. But in general, across the board,
10%.
it was 10%. The people who were in serious need in communities, like when we did our Boston study a couple of years ago, 1 or 2%. And even if you included all of the people who sought out services, even though they from Jewish organizations, the equivalent of JFS, for example, it still didn't get into the double digits. Okay, so these are some of the economic needs and insecurities. And again, I don't know enough about the economics of this area. Was the end of tourism or the suspension of tourism? How did that affect people, and how did it affect people at different places in the economic structure? But I mean, this last question on the left hand side of insufficient savings to afford a $400 emergency expenditure. It's a pretty scary thing. And again, with all of the people who lost jobs and even with the economic supports that were provided by the government, clearly. Next. And this is health needs, the proportion of households. 7% of households include someone who has a chronic health need, a special need or disability that somehow affects their work, their activities, their ability to do school. About half of them were chronic illness issues. Next. And so we did include this, but I have to say, just to repeat my comment from before, I really don't like this category group. Other people are using it, and so we reported it here. But for example, to pull out the point about Latin Jews, a very sizable proportion of Latin Jews are Ashkenazim, are Jews who fled from Poland or Germany and settled in Chile and Argentina and Mexico and so on. So it's not a good thing, but this is the data. And we didn't have enough. The sample, even with 1,400 people, wasn't large enough to be precise. What we are trying to do now is to take data from a dozen or more of our studies and see if we can understand some of these issues better. Next. So the last chapter of the report is a bunch of recommendations, ideas, really to stimulate discussion. Rather than go through them one by one, I'd rather open it up to conversation. I've spoken longer than I thought I would, and I'd like to get your comments, questions. We can talk about some of what do you do with these data from here. Sound like a plan, Keith?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
Maybe just get started.
Sure.
I have my own personal theory as to why the Jewish community in Central Florida isn't as active in the whole community. And I can only talk from my own personal experience. I moved down to Central Florida for a job offer. And I was 61 when I moved here. I would not have accepted that job when my kids were still in school. At that point, my kids all graduated college. I would not have moved here because the community was not the kind of Jewish community I would want to bring kids up. So one of the theories I sort of have is that a lot of people who move down here, I mean, even if they have younger kids, the fact that there's a very weak Jewish community here doesn't keep them from, it's sort of a filter, if you understand what I'm saying.
So two
So,
things.
for those online, the question was really focused about, because our community doesn't have all the things that somebody raising Jewish children might really want in terms of as Dr. Zisman said earlier, the kosher butcher, the robust day schools that go through 12th grade, everything that we've talked about. We're sort of self-selecting the type of people who move to Orlando. And does that sound accurate? That the people who would be more Jewishly involved are choosing not to move here, and the people who being Jewishly involved isn't so important are the ones who are moving here?
So I would say two things. One, the fact that you don't have a large Orthodox community, that's the part of your hypothesis that's correct. That to be Orthodox, you need a community, you need a kosher butcher, all of those things. Although there are Chabad houses all over the world, and they figure out how to do it. But the second thing is that I was a little surprised. Matt's going to have to tell me what the actual number is, but I was surprised at that the number of people who had recently come here was not greater. That you have a very substantial portion of the population. You may not be typical of in terms of how long you've been here. That there are lots and lots of people who've been here for a long time. So the roots issue that people haven't had enough time to build roots here with a family and so on. I don't think it's correct based on the data that we have. And remember, outside of Maitland, you got the Southwest, where you've got lots of young families. I didn't go over in detail the age distribution and so on. You don't have Jewish organizations there. Now, maybe they're self-selecting. Maybe if they
I'm there because I like to live in the Southwest.
okay. Slept here anyway. Wow, what motivation.
That's because I have concert tickets tomorrow night, so I decided to come here.
Okay. No, but it's anything. I don't think it's quite it. And I think there are enough people who have long-standing roots here. I mean, the whole community got, given that 175% increase in the Jewish population, that this has been a magnet for certain kinds of professionals and others to come here. But if you will, it is what it is. And the question going forward is, how do you deal with that? The good part of the good news is that when you have a rate of synagogue and worship community affiliation of only 16%, there's only one place to get up, and so you can think about that.
Yeah, so there are a couple other issues that we couldn't have gotten into. For example, when you talk about people moving here, a lot of physicians moved here when we had the Naval Hospital.
Right.
One. So my contemporaries are aging in. When I came to town, which was 45 years ago, there were 6 or 8 families that really gave all the philanthropy and everything. They're gone, their children are not involved. The other thing that I don't know if you touched on in your studies is the issue of the fact of now having less volunteers. People don't volunteer anymore, so they don't join. I had the opportunity to hear the author in person of the Pew study, and he said the biggest growth in all of these institutions are the nuns.
Yeah, but that's,
None.
yeah,
He
yeah.
said, people don't join anymore. People don't, they're not Boy Scout leaders. They don't volunteer in the PTA. They don't.
So Alan Cooperman, who you're referring to, is a good friend, and I work with him closely. The nuns phenomenon is more of a non, huh? Oh, so the question was, well, I know where the question I'm going to attempt to answer is the question of, is the reason for the low level of engagement by Central Florida Jews simply a trend that's happening more broadly of people being nuns, of not identifying, not engaging particularly with religion. Now, Alan is the head of the religion group at the Pew Research Center. Alan Cooperman, who was Becca Alba, the lead authors of the study, and they've been seeing this phenomenon with the Catholic Church and with Protestant movements, evangelical movements, somewhat different piece. For Jews, though, it's not the same issue because, again, to invoke Mordecai Kaplan, it's not just about belief. And you can't say that someone isn't being Jewish because they don't believe that this guy, Moshe, went to the top of Har Sinai and brought down a set of tablets that he broke on the way down and whatever. You don't have to believe in the literal word of Tanakh in order to be a Jew. In fact, to be a Jew, you have to hold multiple views, often multiple views that are inconsistent with one another. So I'm not ready to accept that's it. I'm not ready to accept the fact, and I think it was part of your question, that these things are fixed, that I know too much about human behavior and how quickly people learn to adapt and change, whatever. And I think, people may have come to Central Florida to escape New York and the intensity of life surrounded by millions of other people, and said you can be in your own car and be in a traffic jam and whatever. But I think what the exciting parts of Judaism that I see today and that I study are the parts of Judaism where I see people who are lonely, who are suffering from a lack of sense of meaning and community. By the way, the research on happiness is that happiness is having relationships with people. Young people in particular, and young families, the disease that they're, forget about COVID for a second, the disease, and so COVID has made it worse because of all of the social isolation stuff. The disease is loneliness and not having interaction. So the question is, how do you build community? How do you build community? Building community is one piece of it, but it's clear that it's not the only piece of it, because you gotta be motivated enough to come to the building. Anything else? Anybody online? Matt?
If they are, they're sending the messages to Federation, not to me.
Chase, do you have further questions?
One person asked whether we could look at giving.
Could we look at giving a little more? So we could. Do you have if there's a specific question, we can try to answer it now. Unless, Matt, do you want to say something more about giving, philanthropy?
Sure. So I think I think like many of the numbers that we see throughout the study, the numbers on philanthropy would have been a little bit better if we'd collected the data during a non-pandemic year. And we had 81% of respondents said they made any kind of donations. That's a little lower compared to what we usually find, but there's no question there's some number of people who in ordinary years would donate, but couldn't because of the financial troubles that came along with the pandemic. It's not surprising that the proportion who donated to Jewish organizations is a little bit lower than we see in other communities. That goes along with engagement being lower than in other communities. But it's clear that, that there aren't huge differences across some of the things where you might expect them. There's no statistically significant difference, for instance, between different age groups and what proportions gave to Jewish organizations. There's some pretty big differences by engagement group. That's not surprising. No differences by age. No differences by having children in the household. And these are things where we typically expect to find differences, but we didn't here. It's again, it's one of these things. I think the numbers would have been better in a non-pandemic year. I think the same is true of volunteering. Roughly 1 in 5 Jewish adults said they'd volunteered for a Jewish organization in the last year. But you think about when we collected the data, it was November of 2020 through February of 2021. In some ways, that was the height of the pandemic. We had to maintain physical distance from each other. And so it was difficult for a lot of people to find the volunteer opportunities that they normally pursue. I think those numbers would have been higher in a non-pandemic year as well. How much higher, it's impossible to say.
Good. We got 2 questions here. Yeah.
So if we're not interested, we want to have increased community engagement and outreach in basically a geographically diverse area. What are other communities doing?
What are other communities doing? So we did a study in Washington, D.C., for the Washington Federation, which is actually located in Maryland, in Rockville. And that whole area to the west of Washington, from Arlington all the way to Dulles Airport, was the area of greatest growth, in some ways like Southwest. And one of the things they did is they established a presence, a physical presence of the, I think they eventually did that, a physical presence where in that area, and worked on active support of the existing organizations and how to engage them in the equivalent of outreach and so on. I think part of it is creating exciting programs for people. I also think, I've told you, I study birthright, I study summer camps. So why am I interested in these? By birth or by training, I'm a social psychologist. And for me, both of those educational programs are 24/7 programs. They're programs where people get to learn and live with one another. And you can accomplish in a 24/7 program so much more than if you took the equivalent number of hours and spread it out, even once a week. And I think you need, birthright and camps. They flip a switch in people. Kids who go to a Jewish content camp are changed for life. It's amazing to meet people who talk about their closest friends being the people that they went to camp with 2020. I see people shaking their heads in here. Everybody's had that, somebody, if you may be one of those people. And so One of the things in community building is to find some ways to take people out of their, whatever their current thing is, and bring them together in these 24/7 experiences. And if you can infuse them properly with Jewish content, my sense is you can do tremendous things. I'm a researcher, so I'm talking, I'm sure there are lots of other possibilities. I'm talking about the things that I know from data that we collect. Yes.
You said that you, in your research of birthright and the folks that you followed over the course of 20 years, the people that had been on birthright, their Jewish connection was very different from people who hadn't. And the thing that is striking to me is in the study, it said that about 50% of the people in our community have been to Israel. And so that would make me believe that those people would be more interested in being involved, or would be amenable, at least in part of their lives to be brought into under the umbrella. But to me, the fact that our engagement is so low, it just means that we're doing a very poor job as a community marketing effectively. And I mean, I know that when a lot of families moved here in the past, decades ago, they would move to where the Jewish community was, because they wanted to be around Jewish community, whereas now people just move to Orlando. And I think that in the past, the Jewish community here at least didn't have to market to Jews because we just wanted to be together. And that transition doesn't seem to have been internalized. So now we need to reach out.
So this is probably not the answer that you were expecting, but I'll tell you what I think about. And I once wrote a piece about this, didn't publish. I think we have to think, in psychology, we talk about lifespan development. We talk about what's appropriate for each age of development. Now, too often in the Jewish community, we have focused all of our education on a particular age. Basically, the resources that we devote to 10 to 13-year-olds is probably more than we devote to all of Jewish education. One goal to B'nai Mitzvah, Bar Bat Mitzvah. So I had this plan, and I said, let's start at the beginning. And why should Lamaz be the introduction that young families get to creating a family? So I had this program, I called it Sarah's Tent. And it was going to be the Jewish version, infusing all of the medical information about childbirth and so on with Jewish content about how to be a family, about how to educate kids. There is something that we can say. And I had one that went there from there to Shalom Baby, to putting an emphasis, as I think this community is about to do, a real emphasis on preschool education. My favorite was, I wanted to, for high school kids, actually no members of the Kaplan family, but I wanted to start what I call the Mordecai Kaplan SAT preparation course. And, why should we allow private companies to teach, in some ways, they're teaching a value of how do you beat out somebody else by finding the tricks to answering the SATs. Is there not a way to teach people, whether it's vocabulary, thinking skills, whatever the skills are that are measured by the tests that make this huge difference in how people, where they go to school and so on, is there not a way to do that with Jewish values? And so for me, part of this is thinking about every stage of life, and I could longer time to tell you about my lifespan model, but every stage of life, to show people that our Jewish values, our Jewish traditions really do make a difference in terms of how people appreciate and think about their lives. So it's probably, again, not the answer that you're looking for, but that's mine off the top of my head. Others? Well, thank you. This has been terrific. Steve, do you want to wrap up?
I think there's one last question.
One left.
Looking at the Orlando Jewish organizations, what advice does the Cohen Center have for us creating an outreach program? Maybe similar to
You have 2 hours.
I'm going to sleep on that one.
On one foot.
Yeah, on one foot.
We almost not.
You know, it's seriously, I mean, it would be presumptuous of me to tell you organizationally what to do or how to organize it. What I think is most important is to get as many people involved. Don't, and I keep thinking of your comments, don't give up on Jewish values, Jewish argument, Jewish thought. You know, I think, and this is not the organizational answer. And this again is not the answer I think you were looking for. But you know, in my view of where we are as a culture, as a society, being Americans, being a Western culture, is that we become, we're individualism is on steroids. And Judaism, but also religion in general, was always the counter to each and every person thinking of themselves as the center of the world. And so the organizational challenge is, how do you engage people in collective creation of something bigger? By the way, the other piece of happiness is to think of yourself as being part of something bigger than yourself. And I think that has to, I'm the professor, so I have ideas. The idea is to make everybody feel that they are connected to other people. Organizationally, how you do that, I'd be in a different business if I actually knew the answer to that question. But it's an important question, so thank you, and thank you all, and thank those of you on Zoom.
So thanks everybody who came both in person and on Zoom. Thank you, Len. Thank you, Matt, for all the work you did to put this together. I think the most important piece now is, you know, we've got this incredible research that highlights lots of challenges, but even more opportunities. And it's critical that we as a community, we as organizations work together to address them. This is how we're going to be able to make the changes that we want to have in our community. There's lots of opportunities, and together we can address them. So in the beginning of 2022, we'll be getting the agency execs and presidents together, you know, board presidents together to begin the conversation about where do we begin and what do we do and what do we need in order to really make the impact that we want to have. How do we increase the numbers that are there? You know, as Len said, one of the advantages of being at the lower numbers that we are is that we can make significant increases without having to get significant numbers. And let's get the ball moving so that we can have the community that we all want. So thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Yeah.